the History Channel.
For the soldiers of World War II, there was nothing more terrifying than falling into the clutches of the enemy. But it was this intense fear and dehumanizing loss of dignity and freedom that triggered some of the most compelling dramas of the war. The real story behind the movie The Great Escape. Resistance fighters escaping torture or execution. Downed airmen evading Nazis deep behind the lines. And Germans escaping from prison camps in America. These are remarkable true stories of great escapes of World War II.
The air war over Europe was a deadly affair. As the Allies and Germans struggled to control the skies, airmen were being shot down, killed, or captured at a startling rate. In the early years of the war, England stood alone, and its ranks were being decimated. The odds of a British airman returning home was less than 50-50. In 1941, Americans joined the fight. The air war intensified, and so did the casualties. By 1945, over 150,000 Allied airmen were killed. A fortunate few survived being shot down. They managed to bail out, but they were now trapped behind enemy lines. Miraculously, some of them evaded capture, often with the aid of resistance fighters. But most quickly fell into enemy hands.
Are you wounded? Twisted ankle. Twisted ankle, but that's all. You can walk after all.
I landed near a farmhouse and asked the local owners if they knew where the Germans were, and they pointed out the door and said, well, there's 3 of them there.
45,000 Allied airmen were captured by the Germans, and they faced a terrifying reality. They were now prisoners of war, headed for a Nazi prison camp.
We suddenly arrived at a place where there was no food, no books, no freedom, nothing to listen to. So that was a fairly depressing effect. I think it's natural that one doesn't want to be put in a cage.
When you first get there, you see all these old parts wandering around the camp, and you think, why haven't they escaped? You know, you've just had freedom. Why couldn't they escape? And then you realize that you go up to the wire and you're going to climb the wire, and there's a guy there with in the goon box with a machine gun watching you. And you realize you've lost your freedom, and it's gone for all time. That's a hell of a shock then. And then you have to adjust to that. Not everybody acted the same way. Some people went crazy completely as soon as they got to prison camp. I don't think it wasn't a fake. They really couldn't stand being locked up there.
Many found this new life unbearable. They became obsessed with one thought: escape.
There were some people who lived, dreamt, ate, escaping, and nothing else. The most obvious way to escape, I suppose, was to walk up to the wire and climb over the top of it. And there were one or two people who did that. And I'm afraid that was beyond my capacity. The method that looked as if it might work and one could expect to survive was to tunnel.
At the Air Force POW camp, Stalag Luft I in Barth, Germany, prisoners dug more than 100 tunnels. Few were successful, but prisoners were never afraid to keep trying. According to the Geneva Convention, it was the duty of officers to try to escape, to disrupt the enemy's war effort. The German guards understood this, and punishments for escape attempts were merely a slap on the wrist, 10 days in solitary confinement, the cooler.
I suppose in ordinary life, to be given 10 days solitary confinement in the cooler would be a nasty experience. If, on the other hand, you were always in a room with 6 or 8 people, then you had peace and quiet for once. It wasn't such a hardship at all.
By 1942, German prison camps were overflowing with downed airmen. So in April, they opened a giant new prison complex at Sagen, Poland, about 100 miles southeast of Berlin. Before long, Stalag Luft III would house more than 10,000 Allied Air Force officers, British, Canadian, and American. The camp was the culmination of everything the Germans had learned about guarding prisoners and preventing breakouts. Stalag Luft III was considered escape-proof. The prison was built deep in the woods, miles from neutral territories, and it was constructed on soft, sandy soil.
The top part was fairly firm earth, but underneath sand went down to unimaginable depths. And so this is why the Germans thought it was escape-proof as far as tunnels were concerned. They didn't think that we would be able to dig tunnels in such conditions.
Despite these obstacles, it was from Stalag Luft III that the infamous Great Escape was attempted. A daring breakout planned by an escape organization of more than 600 men. Engineers building 3 massive tunnels, 30 feet deep, with underground workshops and railways. An ingenious network of forgers, map makers, compass makers, tailors, machinists, and security and intelligence operatives. The Great Escape was immortalized in the 1963 film, but the reality of the escape was even more dramatic than any Hollywood scriptwriter could imagine.
The real astonishment, to my mind, was not that it was done, but that it was possible to do it without the Germans discovering it.
Ironically, Stalag Luft III would prove to be the perfect environment for an escape organization to thrive. Adolf Hitler entrusted the operation of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, to Reich Marshal Hermann Goering. Goering was a powerful egomaniac who had established the Gestapo and the first concentration camp. Part of his Luftwaffe's responsibilities was the care of enemy Air Force prisoners, a frightening prospect for the Allies. But in fact, Goering had been a World War I flying ace, and he always retained respect for all airmen. With some distorted sense of chivalry, he designed Stalag Luft III to be a prison camp, not a concentration camp. Jimmy James was captured when the war was just 10 months old. He endured 5 years in the Air Force camps.
We were treated, in general, humanely. There was no danger of getting written off like they had in concentration camp. Concentration camps were run by the SS, Schutzstaffel, Hitler's special terror troops. Prison camps were run by service personnel, in our case, Luftwaffe personnel. they treated us quite well. In fact, we got quite friendly with some of the prison staff who came in.
We were certainly very, very, very lucky in the Air Force camps, and particularly in Luft 3. We were told that this was going to be the last word in luxury for Air Force prisoners. The idea was to, I think, of the Germans, was that the camp would be so comfortable and luxurious that there'd be no trouble given. We'd all sit quietly there until the Germans had won the war. But of course, the philosophy didn't work.
Barracks were overcrowded and rations were meager. But the real struggle of prison life was excruciating boredom and the loss of dignity and freedom. Des Neely was shot down and captured in May of 1940. He also suffered through 5 years in captivity.
We had one meal a day from the Germans, which consisted of soup, and we had a loaf of bread, which from memory lasted 3 days. In the evenings we played cards and hoped and talked to each other and tried to remember what a steak tasted like and that sort of thing.
John Cordwell was an architect before the war. To maintain his sanity, he kept a visual diary of his prison life. His wartime log offers a remarkable record of life in Stalag Luft 3.
You had to do other things to keep your mind occupied. You had to really think about the future, that there was another life after this.
Prisoners found their own ways to occupy their time and their minds. The Americans played baseball, while the Canadians played hockey. Everyone tried to stay fit. They'd need their strength if they ever broke out. Some continued their education, while others played in the camp band. But everyone yearned for the life they'd left behind.
Apart from women, I think you missed, well, you obviously missed being free. I think you missed your freedom, really. And as time went on, friends came in and they talked about life in England, and you felt it was changing, and it was a whole world apart, really, you know. You felt that life was passing you by.
Dick Churchill was a music lover, and he convinced the Germans to allow him to have a gramophone.
I started off with 2 sets of gramophone records. One was both Tchaikovsky. One was the Sixth Symphony, the Pathetique, and the other was the Nutcracker Suite.
He and his friends wrote letters around the world requesting new albums. By the war's end, they had amassed over 3,000 gramophone records.
You become absorbed in the music, the surroundings recede into the background, and you could imagine you weren't there for a while.
In the spring of 1943, the Germans let the prisoners build their own theater. The inmates staged elaborate productions, with fellow prisoners even handling the female roles.
There was great therapy in doing a theater, believe me. It was a real night out when you went to the theater. We always tried to do something special with our food, make it. It had to be something special that this is something to live for. We always polished our buttons when we went out to the theater.
The theater, again, was part of the German philosophy. Let the prisoners have a theater, it will keep them occupied and they won't think of getting out. It cut both ways. You could get the enjoyment of the theater, and it didn't mean that you stopped thinking of getting out.
Escape remained foremost on many POWs' minds, and they refused to accept the idea that Stalag Luft III was escape-proof. Breakout attempts were constant, almost becoming another sport to keep their minds sharp.
When you're confined like that, apart from the fact it's your duty to try and escape, for a lot of us, it was, I suppose you could call it almost a game. See if you could outwit the enemy.
Most attempts were doomed to failure. Specially trained guards, the prisoners called ferrets, unearthed escapes virtually every time. The POWs realized to achieve a breakout, they needed to organize. South African-born squadron leader Roger Bushell, a successful attorney in England before the war, led an escape group called the X Organization. Bushell had been exiled to Stalag Luft III after 4 previous breakouts from other camps.
Now, we all trusted Roger Bushell, because we knew about Roger. And Roger Bushell then took over as Big X of all escaping activities. And everybody looked to him, and he was the officer in command.
Sidney Dowes was in the same barracks as Bushell and became Bushell's confidant.
Roger's aim was to get out 200 officers at one time through a tunnel, because he said it would disrupt the German war machine if we could get 200 officers out.
It was now March of 1943, and Bushell's plan had been set in motion. For the next year, more than 600 courageous men would dedicate every waking moment towards one goal: the Great Escape. The X Organization now controlled all escape activity in Stalag Luft III. Any other breakout attempts had to be approved by the group. Nothing would be permitted that could conflict with the Great Escape. At the heart of Bushell's plan was the simultaneous construction of 3 tunnels, codenamed Tom, Dick, and Harry.
Before, not only in our camp, but in other camps, we only had one tunnel going at any one time. And when that was found, that meant you had to start all over again. So I imagine what Roger said was, well, let's get 3 going, and if one is found, we can carry on with the other.
An American Lieutenant Colonel, Albert Clark, became Big S, the head of security. He helped find the right men to implement the escape plan.
We interviewed them first to be sure they were legitimate prisoners of war and not scabs that the Germans were trying to send in to learn our activities. So we also interviewed them to find out what their skills and their background was as far as things that might help us. And we never failed to find someone who could do the things that needed to be done.
Canadian Wally Floody was put in charge of the digging operation. He had experience as a mining engineer. He would not be afraid in the terrifyingly tight quarters. The tunnels would be just 2 feet square.
He'd been in the mine so often that it didn't occur to him to be upset about them. Quite a lot of people had terrible claustrophobia, but others had to learn how to do this. Wally never did.
Construction began on April 11th, 1943. The scale of the project was enormous. The ferrets had planted electronic listening devices in the ground, so the tunnels would have to be 30 feet deep. To reach beyond the wire, they would have to stretch longer than a football field. Because the sand was so loose, every foot of tunnel had to be supported with wood. The bedboards that held up prisoners' mattresses fit perfectly.
When they opened that camp, the Germans made a very bad mistake. They put complete sets of bedboards in every bunk. And by the time that tunnel was finished, people were strapped, tying wire and rags in there and rope to sleep on because all their bedboards were down in the tunnels.
To move the immense quantities of dirt, they built an underground railway system. The trolleys could carry 200 pounds of dirt and serve to transport workers as well. Fresh air ran out quickly. To breathe, they built an air pump from backpacks. Air was fed down the tunnels through a pipe fashioned from empty milk cans. Progress in the tunnels was slow, only about 4 feet a day. Diggers worked in two-man teams with primitive handmade tools, and they lived with constant fear of cave-ins. Ken Reese was one of the lead diggers. He knew all too well the dangers of a cave-in.
The time we got falls was really when you were digging, and you'd dig a couple of feet forward. You'd dig perhaps a little too far, and then it might collapse, and then it would cover you, and the number two would pull you out from behind. And the trouble is then, of course, you were in complete darkness because your little oil lamp had obviously been put out by the sandfall, so it was all done in the dark, and that was a bit frightening.
The X-organization had learned from experience that an escape could not succeed without an extensive support team above ground. The biggest problem was where to hide the dirt from the tunnels. The ferrets had removed the sides of the huts so dirt couldn't be hidden underneath. And the sand was bright yellow in color and couldn't be easily spread around the compound. To solve the problem, they designed bags out of towels that they hid beneath their clothing. The prisoners were permitted to build gardens, so the dirt dispersal teams, known as penguins, would painstakingly trickle the sand into the gardens while others spread it into the soil.
In the summer of 1943, the penguins, the guys with the trouser sacks, dispersed 130 tons in all, making 25,000 trips. And that was for all 3 tunnels.
Security was another key component. Absolute secrecy had to be maintained.
One didn't talk about tunnels ever. When it was heard, anybody talking about tunnel, he was jumped on. And everybody was given due notice that you never mention the word tunnel, sand, or anything like that at all. So the Germans couldn't hear anything, they couldn't know anything.
The ferrets were watched constantly by a team of 300 men called stooges. They relayed warning signals to the huts where operations were taking place. Tunnel entrances had to be well camouflaged. Tom's was carved almost invisibly in a concrete floor. Dick's was underwater in a drainage basin in the washroom. And Harry's was hidden under a stove. Escapers would need documents and passports once they were free. Forgers went to work, disguised as students in a classroom, while stooges stood watch. Documents were turned out with extraordinary detail and precision.
One of the things they had me do since I was an architect was to do typewritten documents freehand. And we did each letter very carefully in a light pencil. Then you painted it twice in a watercolor. Then you had a sharp stick to indent the paper. And sometimes one particular letter would have jump the line. Always the same letter, you know, would jump the line as though it looked as though there's something wrong with the typewriter. It sure as hell didn't look like a forgery. It looked like the real thing. It's amazing.
For the finishing touch, official government seals were carved from the heels of boots. To navigate outside the wire, the map department turned out over 1,000 accurate 4-color maps. 200 compasses were created using razor blades and Dick Churchill's gramophone records.
Gramophone records were made from a wax compound, and this could form the non-metallic base for a compass. And a razor blade you could heat and therefore detemper and take a sliver off it and then put it on a magnet of some sort, which could include the loudspeakers that the Germans installed in various blocks in order to put their propaganda out. So if you took a closer look, you would probably find a lot of compass needles on the back, on the magnetic part of the loudspeaker.
The intelligence branch gathered critical information and materials like railroad timetables and cameras for making photo IDs. They bribed and blackmailed the guards with special items the prisoners received from home.
Well, I was able to send 4 parcels a year, and the German population didn't have all kinds of things. Our boys were able to exchange things like coffee and chocolate with the guards because there was none in Germany, and they wanted it so much to take home on their leaves, and therefore they were able to bribe them.
Well, once you got a German who accepted a bribe, he was then at our mercy, because we said, well, if you don't get the answer to the following question, we will tell the Germans that you have given us the following information. So that was enough to keep them, A, quiet about us and keep on giving us information.
Keith Ogilvy, a Canadian, worked with the intelligence branch to help find official documents to duplicate.
One day, the old sergeant that was working with our group had his back to me, and his wallet was sticking out of his back pocket. So I lifted it. I said to Roger, "Get it back as soon as you can." So they took it in, and I guess they photographed all his papers, his identity, and just this is how they got information. They brought it back, and I tapped the old guy on the shoulder and said, "Hans, it's your wallet. You dropped it on the floor." And the old boy nearly fainted. He said, "Oh my God, Mr. Rogan, if I lose that, boy, it's the East Front for me. Boy, I'm so glad. He couldn't do enough for us then."
Tailors fashioned disguises from the prisoners' uniforms and from blankets. Hidden pockets were added to hide escape food. 2 escapers were even fitted with homemade German uniforms.
One of the chaps was going as a German Feldwebel, a sergeant, and his gun was made out of wood, but it was dyed and it looked treated that unless you picked it up and looked at it, you couldn't tell from the real thing.
Through August 1943, the digging progressed undetected. However, the organization found out a new compound was being built. In a few months, the American prisoners would be moved out. Many of these men had worked hard on the tunnels. No one wanted to see them miss their chance to escape. It was decided to put all efforts into Tom, the shortest tunnel. Work was stopped on Harry, and Dick was used to hide dirt. The race was on to escape before the new compound was finished. The ferrets suspected an escape was being planned, but security was so tight they couldn't find any evidence. By mid-September, Tom was almost ready. Some men now believed this year they would again be home for Christmas. But suddenly their dream was shattered. By sheer accident, a ferret discovered the tunnel's entrance.
They were mingling around waiting to leave the hut, and one of the guards had a long steel spike, and he was more or less playing with that, really, jogging it on the ground, and it went down the crack on the trap, and he realized straight away and that was that. They'd found it.
It was great disappointment because that would have been a very good escape because we were at least 20 feet inside the woods. And we could have taken out 200 men with no problem at all.
It was a demoralizing blow. The Americans had lost their chance to participate in the Great Escape. The Ferrets had won this round. But Roger Bushell had anticipated this possibility, and the X organization still had 2 more tunnels up their sleeve. The Ferrets were now on heightened alert. For 4 months, the escapers ceased tunneling operations, hoping their captors would drop their guard. Finally, in January of 1944, diggers climbed down Harry's 30-foot shaft and tunneling resumed. It was decided to concentrate on Harry. It took the longest route to the wire. The Germans would never suspect such a long tunnel. But it was now winter, which made dirt dispersal even more difficult.
When we started up Harry, the snow was on the ground, and we couldn't obviously scatter sand about, and they were wondering what on earth to do with it. In the committee meeting, somebody said, well, what about the theatre? Roger Bushell said, damn good idea, go and have a look.
The theater was perfect. The prisoners had built it themselves and left the sides up, and there was plenty of room underneath. So a trapdoor was built under one of the seats.
So we were able to disperse a lot of sand every night, and we worked out it all every evening for about 2 months on this. And at the end of the time, we dispersed about 90 tons of sand down there.
On March 14th, 1944, Tunnel Harry reached its final length, an incredible 330 feet. After nearly 1 year of work, the escape was almost ready. But it was still bitter cold. The committee had hoped to make the breakout later in the spring, but security simply couldn't hold out much longer. If they left now, the icy conditions would make the route home far more difficult, but at least they would disrupt the German war effort. March 24th, 1944 was chosen as the date for the Great Escape.
One reason being it was a moonless night, and we had to fix on a particular day because all the passes had to be stamped for that day.
The escape committee now faced the difficult task of choosing which 200 men would go out. The first 30 were handpicked by Roger as the most likely to have a chance to get home, usually men who were fluent in German. The rest were picked out of a hat.
One day, I guess, in the middle of March, when one of the boys from the committee come in and said, your name's been picked as one who has a chance to go out in the tunnel. I was, of course, pretty excited at the prospect of getting outside the camp. I'd been in there 3 years, and the prospect of getting outside, walking around, seemed like a good idea at the time. I'd never won anything in a lottery before, and this is as close, I guess, as I was about to come.
The lucky 200 were issued their new identity papers, clothing, money, and escape food. There was no turning back now.
You could feel the excitement buzzing, and it was very dangerous and difficult in a way because people wanted to talk with each other. You know, the less experienced people wanted to talk with the experienced people and get all the information to get from them, and advice. What do we do? How do we do it? Where do we go? All this sort of thing.
There was apprehension. I expect everybody had some qualms about it of one sort or another. But overriding any of that was the fact that you had a chance to get out. You had a means to get out which existed, and this, if you've been scratching in the ground for years on end, hoping that you'd find away, suddenly this one was going to go to work.
The Germans were sure an escape was brewing, but they still couldn't find any evidence. But suddenly, Wally, Floody, and several other key members of the X organization were transferred to other camps. And a warning was issued to all prisoners that escaping was no longer a sport. But few paid any attention.
Our last briefing from Roger, he had us all, the chaps who were going out, and he gave us a briefing on what to expect outside, what might happen, what might not happen. And I can remember very well saying, these Jerrys are pretty foxy guys. They may go so far as to take you up against a wall and threaten to shoot you. But believe me, they'll never do it. They just would never do it.
It was now the night of March 24th, the culmination of all the intense planning and hard work. At nightfall, the first team moved down the tunnel on schedule, but soon they encountered the first of many critical delays.
Probably one of the most important things that we'd forgotten was that there was heavy snow on the floor, on the ground. And underneath the snow is the ice. And the trap door that we were supposed to go out of, we hadn't allowed for the fact that the ice would be across the top of it and would block it. And we didn't have an ice pick. So when it came to opening it, we couldn't open it on time. It was delayed for an hour and a half. I think we were supposed to get out about 8:30 or 9. We got out at 10:30, the first person to get out.
When they finally opened the tunnel, the men were horrified to discover they were 30 feet short of the trees. Roger quickly developed a plan. First man out would crawl to the trees, hide in brush, and signal with a rope to the next escaper when the coast was clear. Other men now moved into the 2-foot square tunnel. Many had never been down before.
It wasn't difficult for the diggers particularly, because we got used to it. But if you can imagine for people who had never been down a tunnel, hadn't even seen it, and they're suddenly faced with this little hole disappearing into the distance, and panic set in with one or two of them.
A few carried too much baggage and knocked down bedboards, causing several cave-ins. More unwelcome delays.
People say, well, what did you do lying in the tunnel for 3/4 of an hour or something while the roof was repaired? The only answer I can give was, well, I just lay there. What else could you do?
To make the trip easier, they had rigged electric lights by tapping off the prison's electrical system with stolen wire. But near midnight, an air raid over Berlin caused the power to go off and the tunnel went dark. 35 more minutes were lost. Progress was slow, but one by one, men began to reach the end of the tunnel.
For me, it was sheer excitement, because one was outside the wire. This was, for however limited a period, it was freedom of a sort. And that was, it was like having a very large whiskey and soda, as it were.
Men continued to scramble to freedom. But suddenly a guard wandered away from his post and was heading towards the tunnel. If he came much closer, all would be lost. By 4:55 a.m., 76 men had escaped, but the guard was moving dangerously close to the tunnel entrance.
I was number 76, actually, and I was lying there watching the tunnel and watching the development of the guard coming closer and closer to the face, and hoping to goodness he'd turn around and go back again, but he just kept coming until he almost stepped right into the opening. at which time this chap who was waiting at the top to make his exit jumped out and took off for the trees. And then I guess all heck broke loose.
The guard fired a shot and Keith Ogilvie escaped into the woods.
I set off down the tunnel, and I was, I suppose, halfway along, and I heard a shot. So I couldn't turn around. I quickly backpedaled, got up into the hut, and of course there was pandemonium in the hut. Everybody was burning papers and eating as much as they could of their rations because they knew it would all be confiscated. Madly eating chocolate bars, etc.
In Stalag Luft 3, guards quickly uncovered the incriminating evidence, while throughout German territory a massive alert was issued. Whatever happened now, the Great Escape had achieved one of its primary goals. More than 5 million Germans had to be pulled off the war effort to search for the escaped prisoners. The escapees were now roaming free. Many, like Dick Churchill and Keith Ogilvie, hiked on foot across the frozen forest, hoping to make the 100 miles to the Czech border. But soon they were betrayed by the brutal weather. Exhausted and frostbitten, they were all picked up by the Nazis. Other escapers like Sidney Dowes, Jimmy James, and Des Neely traveled by train. But under the intense scrutiny of the Germans, their covers were ultimately blown.
I was being interrogated on the train, and I thought I was doing quite well in this little interview. And in the end, he said, "No, I'm sorry, I don't believe you." I said to him, "Where did I go wrong in my interview with you?" And he said, "Oh, you were quite persuasive, but the thing that made me certain that you weren't the fellow you said that you were supposed to be was the fact that the photograph, which had been taken in my escape outfit, in other words, you are wearing the same shirt and tie as you're wearing now." And he said, "That doesn't happen in real life."
Of the 76 who escaped through the tunnel, only 3 made it to freedom. 1 reached Holland by train, while 2 others hopped a Swedish freighter. As the men were rounded up and jailed, most expected a return to Stalag Luft 3 and a lengthy stint in the cooler. But this escape was different. Hitler himself was informed of the mass breakout, and he was furious. His order was for the Gestapo to execute them all. However, Goering convinced the Führer that such drastic action might trigger Allied revenge against German prisoners. So it was decided that 50 would die.
Parties of 6, 8, 10 were taken out by the Gestapo, taken from the jail, and they disappeared. We knew they had gone. We didn't know where they had gone or what was going to happen to them. The optimistic thought was that they had been taken back to Sagan, to the prison camp. In fact, of course, they were being taken out to their deaths.
Each group was driven towards Stalag Luft 3. At some point, the cars would stop and the escapees were told to get out and stretch their legs. Then a Gestapo agent would move in behind them and shoot them in the back of the head. No one really knows how it was determined which 50 would die. There was no logic to the choices. Roger Bushell was executed, while Wings Day, the senior British officer, was spared. Many of the 23 survivors were returned to Stalag Luft 3, and they were officially informed of the hideous news.
British senior officer was sent for. He was told by the commandant that 50 of us had been shot trying to escape. And he immediately went back and said, "Well, how many were wounded?" And the German officer turned his back and with tears in his eyes, read out the official statement again, saying that 50 had been shot trying to escape. So he knew at the time, of course, that it wasn't 50 had been shot trying to escape, it meant that 50 had been murdered.
Several weeks later, urns containing the victims' ashes were given to the men. The survivors were permitted to build a monument to their fallen comrades.
Oh, everybody was shocked with disbelief. The odd occurrence where somebody had made a daredevil attempt to climb over a wire in daylight or something and been picked off by a sentry, this sort of thing was accepted, if you like, as part of the risks. But cold-blooded murder of 50 officers was inconceivable, really. So it was difficult to appreciate to begin with, but eventually it did become clear that it had happened. And everybody had friends there, at least one, 50. It's unbelievable.
Despite this horrific result, escape attempts continued. A new tunnel named George was being built when the war ended. Jimmy James, Sidney Dowes, and Wings Day were sent to the Sachsenhausen death camp. They tunneled out of there, but were again recaptured. 1 year later, the prison camps were liberated by the Allies. In the ultimate act of glorious defiance, the remaining inmates set the buildings ablaze, and they prepared to return home to freedom. They had survived, but they had lost years of their youth at the hands of the enemy. However, there were other more fortunate men who had escaped capture, evading the Nazis deep behind enemy lines.